Ardington has been living and working in what is referred to as a rural mixed practice, I believe farming and veterinary practice, with his wife since 1975, when they settled on a farm, Cranbourne, which is his family sugarcane and cattle farm. So how would you describe Dr. Ardington's work and interest? He has studied the historical hoofprint, I think, of animal herds. In other words, what that means is he studies historical documents on the grazing habits of large herds of animal game. He's particularly interested in the period when large moving herds of grazing herbivores were part of the natural order before human beings began disrupting grassland ecosystems. Professor Dr. Ardington served on the South African Veterinary Council for 18 years and was president during the transition period into the new South Africa. He contributes regularly to agricultural and veterinary journals, writing and researching the history of veterinary practice in South Africa. Welcome, Dr. Ardington.
Thank you. Welcome to a brown past and present and hopefully a green future. We start off with a 2-minute video. It goes along at a rather brisk pace, so please pay attention. You've been looking at a history of the universe, planet Earth, and the emergence and development of life on planet Earth since the time of the Big Bang, 13.8 billion years ago. We're going to look at time in somewhat closer detail than that because the right perspective of time is so important to our understanding of what's going on with our environment. About 20 years ago, I read a book, A Green History of the World by historian Clive Ponting. When I finished it, I thought it should have been called A Brown History of the World, because so much of it described humans turning air brown with smoke and other pollution, water brown with erosion and sewerage, and bearing brown soil with plough and axe and fire and overgrazing. So this first lecture from about 12,000 years ago, the emphasis will be on that, will be about that brown history up until the present day. And then we will have a slightly more hopeful lecture in the second hour, looking at what we might expect if we work towards a green future for the world. This tape here is 13.8 meters long, 13,800 millimeters, and it represents the time on a measurement scale since the Big Bang, the start of the universe as we know it. On that scale, each 1 millimeter represents 1 million years. You're now looking at 3.8 meters of tape, and the significance of that is that is when the first simplest forms of life emerged on our planet 3.8 billion years ago. We're now down to 300 million years ago, and that is when great forests dominated our planet. We are harvesting those forests today in the form of coal, gas, and oil. We're now down to 40 million years. Now, the oldest human skull that has been discovered is close to 200,000 years old. So we know that our species is at least that, has been here for at least that long. But it could have been as long as 400,000 years ago. We just haven't had evidence of that. Taking the very much more optimistic 400,000 years, we have been here for the first 0.4 of a millimeter on the tape, right there. That's an extremely puny length of time for a sometimes arrogant and self-important species to contemplate. So that very, very Big Bang and Homo sapiens emergence just that short time ago. We're going to argue that that arrogance and self-importance has driven and is driving our care of our environment and our lack of care for our environment. And we're going to focus on grasslands on the plains, grasslands in the mountains, and those grasslands that feed us with so much food for all 7-point-something billion of us, those grasslands that we call crops. We have a wide selection of forest and jungle and freshwater and saltwater and deserts and tundra to choose from. But I choose to focus on the grassland environment because we are a bipedal, upright walking species of grassland primate, dependent on the grasslands for most of what supports us. And some of the gifts of the world's grass to us include an amazing abundance and diversity of life, particularly Africa, which tops the world in its splendor of grassland life. Grass buffers the edges of deserts, preventing those deserts from spreading if we look after it. It provides most human food in the form of grains and sugar, as well as in the form of milk, meat, and eggs, all of which can be traced back to grass products in the main. Grass oxygenates and freshens our air and sequesters carbon as it grows, pulling carbon down from air to earth. Those last two, obviously, not when it's being burnt. Grass cleans and regulates our fresh water supply all over the planet. Indeed, more than 90% of South Africa's scanty and precious freshwater resources come from grassland catchments. And finally, if we keep the land well covered with grass, it allows the soil to be conserved, not only to be conserved, but to actually build in depth and fertility over time. About 8 million years ago, two important changes reached a critical tipping point on our planet. They had been developing for a long time. But about 8 million years ago, the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere hit an all-time low after these exuberant millions of years of forest growth. And the second important change is that large areas of the planet got a bit cooler and dried out. The significance of those changes at that tipping point at that time was that those two changes are hostile to trees, which prefer high carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and wet conditions, the term that we use where trees do their best. Tropical rainforest says it all. Grasses, on the other hand, tolerate low carbon dioxide and dry conditions very well, growing right up to the edges of deserts. This put a great deal of pressure on various forms of life, particularly on Africa's primates, which were all forest dwellers. And as a result of adaptation, mutation, selection, and extinction of various species, as a result of all this pressure over this change, a common ancestor emerged. A common ancestor to today's humans, chimpanzees, and bonobos, the three surviving species from this common ancestor today. Staggeringly, we share more than 98% of our genetic material with chimpanzees and bonobos. Unfortunately, we are slightly more closely related to chimpanzees than we are to bonobos. I say unfortunately because chimpanzees are a rather fractious bunch and fight with each other quite a lot and even kill each other like we humans sometimes do. Bonobos, on the other hand, are a particularly gentle, peaceful ape, even in troops of up to 100. So when you next read of an ISIS beheading or one of the more robust sessions of the South African Parliament, you can contemplate rather wistfully what might have been. Finally, the genus Homo emerged, and there's a list of the species there and when they emerged, and today all of them are extinct except you and me. I put Homo naledi at the bottom there with a few question marks because it was only discovered in the cradle of mankind near Johannesburg just a few years ago, and its age and its significance and where it fits in here are all the subject of continuing research. What effect did hunter-gatherers have on the environment, if any? Well, surprisingly, they did have rather substantial effect on the environment, considering how low their technology was and how few there were of them. About 65,000 years ago, there was a little transition to better hunting techniques and more sophisticated weapons. So when human beings began to spread around the world, most large marsupials were hunted to extinction in Australia a few thousand years after humans arrived there. And we think of their high-tech weapon of the time, the boomerang. And when America was settled about 26,000 years ago, various megafauna soon went extinct there, the bow and arrow being their weapon of choice. And in just 3 centuries after colonization, most large species of moa were hunted to extinction in New Zealand. So it appears from hunter-gatherer times, we have had this wired into our species. If it's easy to hunt, hunt it to extinction, then move on to the more difficult, smaller game. Unfortunately, this carries on today because even if we are using animals for totally illogical reasons, for pride and vanity and greed, we carry on doing it and threaten these species with extinction. We move then to the great transition from hunter-gathering to agriculture, which occurred somewhere between 10 and 14,000 years ago, and I'm choosing 12,000, 10,000 years before the Christian era. At that time, 12,000 years ago, there was great animal and plant diversity on the planet, the climax of 3.8 billion years of diversification, with great species stability, a certain background extinction, but also now and then the emergence of new species. And so there was great ecosystem integrity on most parts of the planet, with stable building soil, fresh air, and clean water, the good ecosystem services that all life desires or needs. 12,000 years later, the picture is very different all over the planet in many environments, but particularly on our grasslands. That original picture is of 12,000 years ago is represented by scenes such as this one and scenes such as this one here, a view over the Ngorongoro crater in Tanzania. So 12,000 years later, we have a life diversity crash with so much of the habitat being disturbed with crops, pastures, cities, dams, roads, mines, etc. And this has really led to species extinction and instability. Some biologists estimated that maybe 10 species of our millions of species of life will become extinct today, and the same tomorrow, and the same the next day. largely as a result of habitat invasion, modification, and destruction by Homo sapiens. So this has led to various forms of ecosystem disintegration around the world, with hallmarks of unstable eroding soil, polluted air, and dirty water. That is represented by scenes such as this one from Southeast Asia and this one from South Africa. Today, humans do not have to look very hard or travel very far to find scenes such as this. Right now, you're about 20 minutes drive from scenes such as this, and they're not very environmentally happy scenes. We then move to consideration of the agricultural era, and because time is so important a perspective in our understanding of the environment, we suggest a new calendar. Instead of a Christian era calendar, we're going to use an agricultural era calendar. And that would mean that 12,000 years ago would be 0 AE, and today would be 12,017 AE with all those problems that we have just covered. And 24,000 AE, 12,000 years' time, is the kind of world that you would like your genes, Homo sapiens, to be living in 12,000 years' time, with soil stable and building and these various ecosystem services that are so vital and precious to us. Note that the Christian era is 0.002 of a millimeter on the scale, a very, very short period of time. Some 20 or more civilizations have come into being and collapsed since 0 AE, and most of them last a short time, generally less than 2,000 years. And they include examples there. And a number of isolated, small, developed cultures have come into being and also collapsed eventually. And we're going to have a brief look at 3 of them. The first civilization in Sumeria, in that time frame, a brief look at the Greek civilization, and one look at an isolated island community. These are the remains of Uruk in southern Mesopotamia, the first agriculturally supported city-based civilization in the history of our species. And the question is, why does it support no human and very little other life today? By 7000 AE, Uruk had been going for 1,000 years, a long time for a civilization to have survived. And it survived for another 2,500 years, so one of the longer-lasting ones. And its population was large, and it was quite a lot larger than ancient Athens. They had been using primitive writing for 400 years by that date. And their surrounding villages, agricultural communities with irrigation system, provided the food to sustain the city-based civilization. From 7000 AE, the Sumerian states, this one and the ones to the north of it, who had developed later, were in a constant state of warfare over land and water. Why should that be? Well, in 6500 AE, wheat and barley were planted in Uruk in about equal quantities. 1,000 years later, there was only 15% wheat and 85% barley due to salinization of the soil and decreasing fertility. Barley as a grain can withstand double the salinity of wheat, and that explains the switch. Salinity develops in irrigated soil if the irrigation is mismanaged and the soil is flogged for more production and not allowed periods of rest and fallow and change. But despite the change to barley, the yields continued to fall by 40% over that period and to a staggering 65% drop in yield by that period. Reports at the time refer to the earth turned white, a clear reference to salinization. So there wasn't enough food to maintain civilization. It was seriously weakened, and that opened it to conquest, which duly happened and completed the environmental, social, and economic collapse. So by that date, 2,800 years after the civilization started, Uruk was an underpopulated, impoverished, backwater of empire. So civilization moved north to other Mesopotamian states. And unfortunately, the process was repeated. In the words of Winston Churchill, the great lesson of history is that we do not learn the lessons of history. Because in 10,800, Mesopotamia had 1.5 million people supported by agriculture, city-based civilizations. Just a few hundred years later, because of the same kind of things that had happened in Uruk, it was weakened and subjected to the Mongolian conquest. And just a short few hundred years later, the population had crashed to a tenth of what it had been just 700 years previously. We move on to another consideration. Who wrote this? What now remains compared with what then existed is like the skeleton of a sick man, all the fat and soft earth having wasted away. There were trees not very long ago. There were many lofty trees and boundless pasturage for flocks. It was enriched by the rains which were not lost to it as now by flowing from the bare land into the sea. But the soil was deep, storing up the water in the retentive earth, providing abundant spring water at spots where fountains formerly existed. I've cheated a bit by leaving out a few key phrases, which I now include in red. The yearly rains from Zeus, and whereof the shrines still remain even now of these spring waters and streams. I said we were going to talk about Greek civilization, so by now you should be getting pretty close to the answer. This immensely wise man, 2,400 years ago, without any modern education in botany, ecology, soil science, the dynamics of erosion, etc., sent us this warning, a warning which we have all too often ignored in the subsequent civilizations after the Greek civilization. The Battle of Thermopylae occurred in this state, an extremely famous battle where Leonidas and 300 Spartans, just 300 of them, defended the pass for 3 days against the Persian army, preventing the destruction of the Greek navy and the conquest of the whole of Greece by the Persians. Accounts of battles are useful to ecological historians because they often describe the battlefield in some detail. So we know that at the time of the Battle of Thermopylae, the cliffs of the pass abutted onto the sea. But after all of those centuries of erosion described by Plato, today the foot of those cliffs are 2 kilometers from the sea. Here is a depiction of the Malian Gulf and the pass of Thermopylae, showing the solid red line with the shoreline in 2500 BC, the dotted line with the shoreline at the time of Thermopylae, there it is at the base of the pass, 1876, and the blue line, the modern shoreline. This distance here is more than 10 kilometers, showing the huge amount of silt brought out of Greece, silting up this gulf with valuable, precious, life-supporting topsoil. Where there are no rivers bringing silt into the Gulf, the shoreline has changed very little. We move on then to consideration of a small island community. It doesn't get much smaller and more isolated than this one, Easter Island in the middle of the Pacific. There it is, and that's how small it is. So it is very isolated, and intrepid Polynesians in their ocean-going craft arrived here with their chickens and the seeds of their main crops. And they spent 6 centuries building big statues called moai for who knows what political and religious significance. We don't know. The main statue building occurred during this period here. There were 12 clans on the islands, each with a chief, and they spent 6 centuries competing for stone at the quarry, land, water, fresh water, and timber, competing for status, power, and prestige in these statues, as I said, for whatever political or religious reasons. The statues got ever larger as the self-importance increased. And the largest statue, considering the technology of the time, is a staggering 270 tons. And it still lies there in the quarry, untransported to its clan's territory, unfinished, as an enduring monument to human arrogance and self-importance. These huge statues could only be transported using large logs, so they cut down all the big trees to transport the statues for 6 centuries. What happens? Deforestation, erosion, and hunger and war collapse the environment, the society, and the economy. When they had cut down and rendered extinct their last large trees, there was no timber left to build ocean-going boats for them to escape their plight. And so they stayed there in a very degraded environment until the Europeans arrived. Unfortunately, then their circumstances did not improve at all, because the Europeans brought a culture of slavery and a disease called smallpox that they had never been exposed to before. So we look at those 3 collapsed historical situations. The important lesson of Easter Island is that smaller, isolated communities with more limited resources collapse a little bit quicker in a few centuries rather than over a couple of thousand years. And the lesson is that we, 7-point-something billion humans, have now colonized all parts of the planet. We are now the small island with limited resources, and there's nowhere else to go. We now move into modern times and look at grasslands in this situation. And I'm going to continue to focus on grasslands and continue to focus on South Africa and on KwaZulu-Natal, where I come from. I actually consider eroding soil to be a much more important and immediate issue than climate change right now. The reason is this. This animal has been adapted over many centuries to produce beef to feed humans in the chilly highlands of Scotland. And this animal has adapted over many centuries to produce beef to feed humans in subtropical, warm, coastal KwaZulu-Natal. So we and our animals and our plants, with our artificial selection imposed on these animals and plants, can indeed survive in extremes of climate. Not so if we lose the soil, its ecosystem services, the grass that feeds the cow, and the cow that feeds us eventually. So I consider it to be very, very important. I'm not saying that climate change is unimportant, but the emphasis at the moment is completely out of touch with reality. Other reasons I think that this is so is that there is almost no publicity and awareness about soil erosion. I'm going to ask for a quick show of hands. How many of you know that 2015 was the declared International Year of the Soil by the United Nations, and that you are currently living through the decade of the soil declared by the United Nations? 3 hands. So my point is well made. This is full of hype and money and meetings and Leonardo DiCaprio's and all of that sort of thing. So it's enjoying far too much attention. This is a 12,000-year history. Our present climate change is a relatively recent phenomenon, the one that's on us now. Many have occurred in the past, but this one, we are thinking, is affecting civilization. There's extensive experience and research here from the time of Plato. There's little research in the current phenomenon. It's ongoing. This is insidious and very low key. Perhaps that's why there's so little publicity and awareness. And because it's insidious and low key, it creeps up on you and reaches a tipping point. This is more dramatic with extreme weather events and disappearing glaciers and shrinking ice caps. This collapses civilizations. We've seen that. Not yet. And this has many proven conservation measures, and here it's too early to tell. So that's why I defend the focus on that. The climate change could be the subject of another talk. A mass faunicide of game on the grasslands of the world occurred during this 50-year period. So why did this huge shoot-out of the Earth's great moving, migrating grassland herds occur over this period? Two reasons. By 1840, men with guns, ploughs, fences and cows had spread over all the grasslands of the planet. And the other thing that happened about 1840 is firearms improved a great deal, from old-fashioned slow-loading, muzzle-loading firearms to sped-up loading and huge improvements in accuracy. We're going to now look at some historical accounts of how things were in the good old days to show just how massive an ecosystem disruption we have caused. This is an artist's depiction of what was described as the greatest hunt in history. One of the hunters was no less than Prince Alfred, son of Queen Victoria, and it was quite well described by a hunter called Bissett. You can take your attention off the slideshow for a few minutes while I read to you. This is what Mr. Bissett had to write about his day's hunting. The whole plain was one massive moving game. Antelope, quagga, zebra, eland, ostrich, blesbok, hartebeest, wildebeest, etc. We commenced firing into the whirling throng as fast as guns could be handed to us. Prince Alfred and Curry took to their hunting hog spears and charged in, driving home their blades into the infuriated animals. The slaughter was tremendous. How many fell on the spot, were caught by the Kaffirs or died afterwards, would be impossible to tell. The sportsmen looked more like butchers than sportsmen. His Royal Highness and Curry were red up to the shoulders with blood. These people considered themselves to be good, educated, civilized, Christian English gentlemen. In 1843, French naturalist Adolphe de la Gorgue trekked from Pietermaritzburg to Potchefstroom. As he approached the Vaal River from the south, he wrote, "We continued towards the Vaal River. Grazing became more and more sparse, and when we found ourselves surrounded by enormous herds of gnus and quaggas, there was not a blade of grass to be seen. Everything that had not been cropped by their mouths was trampled by their feet." And de la Gorgue went on to say how his trek oxen nearly starved for 5 days because there was no grass available. It had all been cropped and trampled flat. In 1849, Sir John Fraser wrote this about the legendary migration of the springbok and other animals through Beaufort West. "The town was awoken in the morning by a sound as of a strong wind before a thunderstorm, followed by thousands of all kinds of game. Wildebeest, blesbok, springbok, quaggas, eland, antelopes of all kinds, which filled the streets and gardens, grazing off everything eatable, drinking all the waters in the furrows, fountains, and dams. It took 3 days for the trek to pass through Beaufort town. The town and country around it were left looking as if a fire had passed over it. It was indeed a wonderful sight." In 1878, George Mossop was hunting out the last of the Highveld herds with Boer biltong hunters. Our camping ground is now occupied by the town of Darvel. The scene which met my eyes the next morning is beyond my power to describe. Game, everywhere as far as the eye could see, all in the move, grazing. The game didn't appear to be moving. The impression I received was that the earth was doing so, carrying the game with it. They were in such vast numbers, moving slowly and steadily, their heads down, nibbling the short grass. Hundreds of thousands of blesbok, springbok, wildebeest, and many others were around us. If we look at the key phases that these people wrote, we get an idea of the sheer scale of things, the likes of which we will never see in our country again. Bissett, "The whole plain was one mass of moving game." De la Gorgue, "Not a blade of grass to be seen." Fraser, "Left looking as if a fire had passed over it." And Mossop, "The game didn't appear to be moving. The impression I received was that the earth was doing so." You cannot cause such massive and very sudden, just over a 50-year period, disruption to an ecosystem without consequence, particularly when you replace what you had with overgrazing livestock and with ploughs bearing the soil and destroying the integrity of the veldt ecosystem. Fortunately, we can find a large herd of moving, migrating animals in the world, not too disturbed by guns, fences, cows and plows, and the people that abuse that technology. And I'm sitting in the middle of a herd of over 1 million of animals on the Great Plains of the Serengeti in Tanzania. Notice here, despite the fairly low rainfall, how dense the cover of grass is. No bare land visible, everything packed close with grass. It was a long time ago since the South African veld enjoyed anything like this or like this. Again, notice the absolutely dense grass cover here with no bare ground visible. It was also a long time ago since the South African veld enjoyed what happens here when the rainy season ends. The animals migrate hundreds of kilometers away, and the veld is afforded a long period of rest and recovery. So we look at the situations before humans, and here I mean modern humans, humans of the last few hundred years, and when there were no modern humans on the veld. Veld became dominant with these large moving migrating herds, therefore short duration in massive high densities. As you heard from the historical ground accounts, the ground itself seemed to be moving. They were so closely packed together, followed by a movement and migration away with adequate, good, long recovery of the veld, dense cover of grass, and therefore not eroding soil, but building soil over the millennia, and an astonishing biodiversity of life holding it all together. When you look at the grasslands in my province, you see grass. But grass species in the veld of KwaZulu-Natal are a sixth of the plant species actually there. 5/6 they're not very prominent in terms of mass on the veld, but there are 5/6 other species. So this was altogether, before modern humans, a pro-life scenario. Today we have almost the opposite in a way of this situation, with livestock and crops prominent in small herds for long durations, overgrazing normal, bare ground visible as normal, eroding soil as normal, and comparatively few species of domestic animals and plants don't hold this all together particularly well. So we have much more here of an anti-life scenario on millions of square kilometers of veld all over the world's grasslands. We look at artificial grasslands here, a planted hayfield, farmed grasslands, the veld here and the veld here, showing those typical signs of abuse and soil eroding away. Natural veld, not farmed, up in the mountains there on those green mountain tops. And we look at pastures grazed by cows under irrigation, and we look at cropland as well. First, we look at the commercial farming situation. If you drive around this country from here to Johannesburg up the N1 and then from the N3 down to Durban, this is what you normally see, almost opposite to the historical accounts. Relatively small animals, herds of animals, not moving and migrating to allow the veld good, long, adequate recovery. That's what you normally see. And of course, if you abuse the South African veld and graze it in the wrong way with the wrong timing and the wrong recovery periods and the wrong use of fire for long enough, eventually the grass dies and the soil washes away in its hundreds of millions of tons, as you see it doing here. I make a habit of sometimes asking people, from primary school children to PhDs, how fast does new soil form? And they normally have to think about that quite a bit and don't come up with a confident, accurate answer, because new soil forms from the weathering of the underlying rock at the rate of a few centimeters per 1,000 years. It varies a little bit according to the hardness of the rock, but it's always very slow, a few centimeters per 1,000 years. So here you see tens of thousands of years of soil washed away in this deep donga and on this bare ground in the surface here, overlooked by the Drakensberg Range, slowly watching a province erode away into the sea. Besides looking at that gross damage there, you need to go into the veld and look close up as to what is going on out in that veldt, what eventually leads after decades or centuries to the bare ground and the deep dongas of no life-supporting soil. And in this particular slide here, we have both a miracle and a tragedy. The miracle is how brilliantly this column of soil is protected by the deep root systems of the grass plants growing on top of it. The tragedy is that where there's no cover around the base of this column of soil, the soil has eroded away far faster than a few centimeters per thousands of years. Thousands and thousands of life-supporting soil, years of life-supporting formed soil has gone from around the base of this column. A month ago, I collected this Tugela river water and I let it settle for a few days, and then I added some alum to precipitate the last of the particulate matter. And there's about 5% silt in the bottom of that water. A little bit more than that in mass, about 6 and a bit percent, because of the salt. So the salt is heavier than the water. Now we've had a big drought in KwaZulu-Natal, and we haven't yet had a particularly good summer. The dams are still in trouble, not very full. We had a good November, but a very, very dry, below average December. So this is not above average siltation. This is normal or below normal siltation. What I'm going to do is shake up these bottles of water so that they are as I collected them from the Tugela River a month ago. This is the new normality for the past 200 years of South African rivers. I'm going to hand these bottles around so that you can look at them and contemplate them for a few moments and cry your beloved country bleeding into the sea. We then move from the commercial farms to the Ngonyama Trust, tribal communal lands of the Zulu people. All too often, it's a disaster of veldt managed in the wrong way, with the wrong timing periods, with the wrong recovery, and the wrong use of fire, so that the tough, resilient South African veldt eventually gives up with so much abuse, and the soil washes away, leaving this wasteland that you see here. Of course, when an environment like this heads into collapse, the human communities living there also head towards social and economic collapse. We've heard that before in the historical accounts earlier on. And this derelict, abandoned building here is just such an indicator of that social and economic collapse, because there's no food and no income to be made from this ground in the foreground here. Here is the presidential residence at Nkandla, and there is the president's cattle kraal. Out on the slope there, you can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 head of cattle. 4, 5, and 6, 1, 2, and 3. The point of this photograph is that there shouldn't be any cattle there now and for a long time into the future, because the veldt is severely overgrazed and increasing areas of bare ground are appearing and washing down these steep slopes and this bare bank of the stream and heading off to the sea. I have been informed from what I read that there are 783 charges pending against our president right now. To my mind, they are of absolutely trivial significance to our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren. What is really important is the 784th missing charge, overgrazing the veldt and eroding our future into the sea. That's the important charge that nobody is talking about. If you go to Nkandla, you will find an iconic South African tree, Boskia albatrinca, the shepherd's tree, in Zulu, Mviti, in Afrikaans, Witgatboom. This is a valuable browse tree in hard times. It provides nutritious browse. But if you overgraze the grass veldt, the times are always hard, and the shepherd's tree gets selectively hammered all the time. by the goats and cows. So now you will not find a shepherd's tree in reach or of a cow or a goat at Nkandla. The animals are there all the time. There are no movements and migrations to allow recovery, and the new seedlings of shepherd's tree never accumulate enough leaf to survive. So that in maybe 100 years, maybe 200 years' time, the iconic shepherd's tree will be extinct in Nkandla if this management carries on. One cannot help thinking of those Easter Islanders cutting down their last big tree. What I find ironic about all of this is that our president came into power with a loudly stated commitment to rural development. I think he must have meant building his house. We now move on to the present day. We consider the present day and consider this wild environment, the KwaZulu-Natal Drakensberg. Besides its beauty, this environment is extremely important because it's the source of so much of our precious, scanty freshwater resources. Up there, close to these mountains, the rainfall's very high. It exceeds 1,200 millimeters of rain per annum. So what's going on here? Well, one of the remarkable things about the Drakensberg, although it's a very growthy environment for grass, that if you go there, you see hardly any animals. Sometimes I go there for a weekend, and the only animal that I see resembling an eland is the statue of one in the car park of the Sandrock Art Museum. And if I do see them, they're in small herds of 5 or 10 or 20. And yet they used to occur in these mountains in much bigger herds, together with lots and lots of other game. In the winter, they would then migrate down to the Thornveld, to sweeter, warmer veld. But that's no longer possible because there are guns, plows, fences, cows, roads, and cities and towns in the way, preventing that seasonal migration, that long recovery, that intense impact at certain times. Now, if you don't graze a grass or defoliate it in some way regularly, it will go moribund and die. It depends on regular defoliation. So if you don't graze it, you've only got one other tool to use, and that's to burn it. And this grass here was burnt about 6 months ago, before the start of the growing season. And because there are very few animals to graze it, most of it's grown out to maturity and seed. And any of it that was grazed in this last season, maybe 5, maybe 10% of it, will grow through to maturity in the next season. Well and good, the grass is rejuvenated, but with such frequent burning and minimal grazing, what are the disadvantages? Well, if you take slopes like these and you bare the soil with fire every third year, but let's think of that in a different time frame. Let's think of 333 fires in 1,000 years. And if you think not of 1,200 millimeters of rain a year, but 1.2 kilometers of rain in 1,000 years. Some of it, in fact a lot of it, vicious berg thunderstorms. And throw in a really nasty flood every century. So 10 really nasty floods. So if you bare the land 333 times in 1,000 years and rain onto it, 1.2 kilometers of heavy rain with 10 really nasty floods, do you think that the soil is going to erode away faster than a few centimeters per 1,000 years? Well, this tall grass here in the foreground hides a multitude of sins, but if you look carefully, you can see little breaks in the recover of the grass there and there and there and over there. So we'll take a walk up there and have a look. And in this very high rainfall, very growthy environment, we see shocking grass cover, lots and lots of soil eroding from around the bases of these grass plants far faster than a few centimeters per 1,000 years. Compare this slide with the dense cover of grass and a much lower rainfall under the hooves of those wildebeest on the Serengeti. Another slide shows us the appearance of a patch of rock with no soil left on it whatsoever, unable to provide ecosystem services of fresh air and clean water through a mantle of life. So the question is, where does this all end? Well, in a few centuries' time, this management, I believe, will end in a denuded Drakensberg, with dirtier, less regular freshwater resources, and with much nastier floods, all of that heavy rain coming off this bare rock instead of being released slowly through a good, dense mantle of life. We now move out of KwaZulu-Natal to the Karoo National Park near Beaufort West. Just a few kilometers from that massive migration described by Sir John Fraser in 1849. Now, the farm on which Beaufort West was built, the farm's name was Hooivlakte, because to European eyes it looked like a huge area of grass. And when you next drive through Beaufort West, if you see anything that looks like a big hayfield, please let me know. I'd like to see it. So in the Karoo National Park, you're seeing lots of rocks and bare ground and karoo bossies and very little grass. And that's rather poor soil there. But the Karoo National Park also has good, deep, red, loamy soil. Unfortunately, the position doesn't change such much. A couple of struggling grass plants here, lots and lots of karoo bossies, and even with the very, very low rainfall of just 250 millimeters a year, thousands and thousands of years of formed soil eroding away in these dongas in the middle distance. We've now had a look at 4 South African veld environments: the commercial farming environment, and the Ngonyama Trust Land of the Zulu rural people, the Drakensberg, and the Karoo National Park, all varying widely in altitude and latitude and rainfall and temperature. And all of them are slowly and insidiously heading towards an endpoint of ecological bankruptcy. Not good. We're now moved, just to show you that this is not an exclusively South African or African phenomenon, we move to the United States to end our look at brown history. Captain John Fremont became famous for opening the Oregon Trail, which opened the way for thousands of American pioneers to migrate west, the 1849ers to the goldfields of California, and many after them. And he describes coming across a herd of bison, which he describes as buffalo. And this is what he had to write about them. I just put up this phrase: they were swarming over the plains where they had left scarcely a blade of grass standing. Compare it to the South African accounts. Mr. Preuss, who was the artist on this team and was in the background, had at first noticed them as large groves of timber. Imagine seeing a big mass of animals so closely packed together at a distance that you mistake them for large groves of timber. Now, the Americans shot out nearly 60 million bison, almost to extinction, as well as invaded their habitat so that they starved and what have you. And the indigenous Americans were dependent on the bison for their food, their clothing, and their shelter, to build teepees on these treeless plains. So they began to starve, and they fought the United States Army for their land and lost, descending into social and economic collapse. The settlers replaced the indigenous people with themselves, and they replaced the bison with cattle. And they overgrazed the prairies in very, very different ways to the massive, moving, migrating herds of bison. And they also, for the first time in many millennia, bared the soil to the sky with plows to plant wheat. And as a result of that abuse of guns and plows and fences and cows, the great American Dust Bowl was born. And it came to a peak in the droughts of the early 1930s, and that's the area that it recovered there. Strong winds over these treeless plains picked up the loose soil and blow it away over a period of years in its hundreds of millions of tons. Very old people and babies and people with lung diseases like asthma got sick, and a lot of them died. During the more severe storms, the cattle inhaled so much dust that they failed to cough it clear, and they formed mud in their lungs and suffocated in their thousands. So the farmers of Oklahoma and surrounding states went broke and into social and economic collapse, just 60 years after this abuse. When you use technology to destroy the environment, everything happens much faster than the 2,500 years that Uruk took to collapse, and much faster than the 600 years that Easter Island took to collapse. So I end this first talk with a quote from Bill Bryson in his splendid book, A Short History of Nearly Everything. If you were designing an organism to look after life in our lonely cosmos, you would not choose humans for the job. But here's an extremely salient point. We have been chosen by fate or providence, or whatever you wish to call it. As far as we can tell, we're the best there is. We may be all there is. It's an unnerving thought. We may be the universe's supreme achievement and worst nightmare simultaneously. If I have driven you to the edge of a suicidal depression for this talk, please hang on for the second lecture. I want to have an opportunity to give you some hope. The second lecture is about 10 or 15 minutes shorter than this one, and we will take a 10-minute break now. Please be back in 10 minutes. Yeah, we need to get out of this. Like that. And put up the next one. Simple as that. Let's hope it goes up.
Did you double?
Yeah.
Is there also a video in this one?
No videos.
No videos.
Simple.
Easy. Okay.
Thank you.
No problem.
Hello.
Hi.
I'm Philip.
Peter.
You came here last year, didn't you?
I did.
Will you be coming here next year?
Well, I don't know. It's
Because the reason...
what the problem with summer school is you can never get give the same course twice. It's a hell of a job to put the talk together.
Because one subject really current at the moment is subject of water. Are you...
Absolutely.
Because...
Just after our drought.
It's utterly critical now.
Absolutely.
But not only in South Africa, but worldwide.
Absolutely.
So while we're suggesting you're not to be presumptuous, next year could you talk on water?
It's all linked to looking after the catchment areas.
Yes, it is, but specifically how absolutely critical it is.
Well, that wouldn't be so much of an effort because I could use this the soil conservation to underpin it.
Here in the Western Cape, the latest talk is now that we'll only be able to water our gardens on a Wednesday and a Sunday, I think, at and only between 6 in the evening and 6 in the morning. That's what the next phase is.
Yeah. The thing is that I've been a veterinarian and a farmer and a conservationist and an environmentalist as far as the land is concerned all my life. I know a great deal about it.
Yes.
Okay, I'm confident in it.
I know that.
Yeah, I don't know much about water. Not as nearly as much, but you'd need, I'd have to go to engineers and hydrologists and geologists to find that. It would be a lot more work for me because it's not my...
I'm interested in water because, I come from the Karoo, well, let's say ancestors came from the Karoo.
Yeah.
And I remember the earliest day, Uncle of mine saying it was raining, and he said, "Thank God it's raining."
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Hi.
Hi.
Alec Anderson.
Peter.
Do you know John Anderson, the Gondwana Alive? Have you heard him at all? This is John Anderson.
Heard of him. I've never met him or known him. Yeah.
I'm involved with Gondwana Alive here up in the Transvaal.
Okay.
Francis Thackeray, you must have heard of him. Anyway, what I'm dealing with is a campaign up in the Grootvaardersbos area where we're getting rid of these alien species in the form of Acacia melanoxylon and manzii. Do you deal with that in what you're going to talk about this afternoon later?
I don't deal with alien plants.
Okay.
One of the problems is, for such a vast subject, 2 hours not a long time.
Sure.
Okay, but I've got alien plants on my farm. I spend a whole lot of money and effort trying to get rid of them, and I'm extremely aware of the South African alien plant threat to the environment.
Is there, because the thing that we're trying to do is get rid of the alien
Absolutely.
and put back indigenous.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, from a sort of general idea of the brown and the green, what work has been done in your area in that respect?
Yeah. One of the things that I worry about is that we're taking out these alien plants, we're restoring the veldt, we're not introducing and managing the animal factor in the right way.
Yeah.
People say, the fynbos never had grazing animals in it. You know that Jan van Riebeck and his predecessors built a huge hedge at Kirstenbosch to keep the lion out of the cattle.
Yeah.
And a lion needs 350 head of breeding impala or springbok to keep it alive every year. There were a lot more migrating and moving animals here 400 years ago, before 1652, than they are now. And nobody's looking at that. Because I think, I'm a veterinarian, that's my background. I think the right animals in the right way with the right timing. I mean, one of the things that a crowd of animals do is they just reduce your fire fuel load amazingly. They just bang. Okay.
But what we've got down in the Cape, I'm talking about around Swellendam, Heidelberg area, that part of the world, is Kikuyu comes back.
Yes.
And what's your view of that as opposed to the sort of grasslands that you've been talking about?
Well, it's a monoculture grassland, so it doesn't please the ecologist in me with regard to biodiversity.
Sure.
But on the other hand, good cover is better than none.
Yeah, no, sure. It's just that it's a tremendous fire risk. That's unless you graze it.
Oh no, animals crowded together make a magnificent fire break.
Exactly.
Okay. A lot of the people said, the old fires used to burn for days. There was nothing to stop them. But, very often, in my opinion, the fires would come up to where animals had grazed it flat, leaving not a blade crossing. Right. And the fires would creep along there because there was so little fuel. They'd get up to a watercourse and they'd quit. They didn't go hundreds of kilometers.
Do you have would you go for goats or, because we're not a...
I'd go for biodiversity.
Would you?
Bigger animals and smaller animals, if I could. I would like to farm goats, but I can't because they get stolen by Zulus so easily. I just need a bit of time to...
Sure.
Where did you get that Greek?
The Greek stuff?
Yeah, including that diagram of the closing up of that bay.
I got it off the internet.
Did you?
Yeah.
Amazing.
I looked hard, and in fact I had somebody helping me with some of the slides, the photograph, the map of Easter Island and what have you. I farmed it out and said, please find me this stuff. But it's an interesting 2,400 years.
I love the place over.
Oh, it is magnificent. Hello.
Are we going to leave with some positive?
I told you that I was going to give you hope for the next lecture.
Listen, do any of the following names mean anything to you? Jeremy Tim, Nancy Stevens, John Deeney, Chippy Olver. Not. Okay.
4 names. I'm sorry about that.
No.
Okay. Yeah. I have spent most of my life being too busy, being a veterinarian on call. Yeah. And now that I'm in semi-retirement, I'm feeding this passion.
Okay. Because they're all into that stuff.
Right. Do you have the time?
It's about 4 minutes past 2.
Okay, we need to get going. We've had about 10 minutes.
Yeah, that's 1 minute more.
Okay.
finished.
Yeah. I'm a retired, semi-retired veterinarian farmer, and I am using my semi-retirement to feed my passion, which is grassland and what have you. So yes, I am available.
The reason I ask,
I don't need to make a lot of money out of it, but I would like my accommodation and transport paid for, obviously.
Sure. The reason I ask is I'm linked to the Food Science Association, and we have a biannual conference. The next one will be in September. It may have its program full, I don't know.
Yeah.
I think what you're trying to do here is very relevant for people in the food industry to really understand.
I'd be happy to be part of that.
Do you have a card?
Not with me. Yeah, I think we must start. Please take your seats.
Marianne's got a nasty spider bite. We're going to go to Sunset West to have it treated by the wound people.
Did that happen now, this morning? Thank you.
About the year of the soils. Just so you know, the reason why the whole thing collapsed is because the FAO refused to endorse conservation agriculture and only endorsed organic agriculture. So the whole issue of cover crops, the whole issue of covering the soil, proper soil rotation, building up where it can, looking after soils, got lost in this battle between organic and non-organic. And it was horrifying at the UN, and I had people stamping around, etc. So that's why we didn't get the same thing as getting Leonardo DiCaprio talking about climate change. People couldn't agree the conservation agriculture, whether it's organic or not organic, is the way forward.
Look after the soil. Look after the soil.
I have spent the last 3 years doing this.
Okay.
So I'm going to decide looking forward to change.
Right, we need to get started. Thank you. I left one little snippet of information out of the end of my last talk. There are still dust storms in the Dust Bowl area of America today, and they're not nearly as severe as they were because a lot of the fine particulate soil has already gone, because the ruined land is no longer put in under plough, and because the grazing management has improved a bit. But soil still continues to blow away there and erode in other parts of the United States faster than it forms. And as far as I'm aware, neither Hillary nor Donald chose to mention this long-term threat to American civilization during their long and bruising election campaign. And if they had, because of our culture and our education in this world, it would have gone straight over the head of the American voter, totally unconcerned with and uneducated in the special interconnectedness of life, soil, air, and water. And it does boggle the brain that a society and an economy that could put a man on the moon in 11,969 fails to conserve its soil in 12,017. There must be something very wrong with that economy and that society from an environmental perspective. Now, we could talk about a green future of the world by swapping this aerosol can of shaving cream with this cake of shaving soap and things like that. The can having a harsh environmental footprint of can manufacture and mining, of chemical foaming and propellants and foams, and of a litter problem afterwards. And we could talk about reusing, reducing, and recycling. And we could talk about the triple bottom line and all that we do at work and at play. But we have heard it all before. The world and its leaders do not take very much notice about it, and I think I'd bore you quite quickly. So instead, what I want to look at is an environmental revolution. Not the quick stone-throwing, library-burning kind of revolution, but a slow, steady rational revolution with that different perspective of time that we've already looked at. A revolution gaining strength 12,000 years into the future. So in a quick summary, we have to deal with people issues that are bedeviling our progress in this regard, that are in the way of our revolution at the moment, and technological issues, how we use and abuse technology. And the people issues are, of course, our increasing numbers, wrongly structured economies, and wrongly structured societies for an environmental revolution, and the wrong values to affect change in the economies and the societies. Not life affirmative values, an attitude of arrogance and self-importance towards other forms of life, short-term thinking, the next election, the next business cycle, not the next millennium, not where are we in 12,000 years' time, and a conspicuous consumption lifestyle that so many people want these days. I've heard some social commentators refer to this as the modern disease of affluenza, and the best definition I've come across is that it is a modern disease in which people believe that having too much is still never enough, and it's not particularly good for the environment. The technological issues that are abused and that we have to worry about, the scale of them, how they're carried out to maintain our hopefully mostly middle-class lifestyles, are ploughs and guns, mines and oil drilling, mass manufacture of unnecessary goods, intensive agriculture with all its polluting and chemical problems, some 70,000 synthetic chemicals in the world in current use, and fire in all its forms: coal, gas, oil, felt, forests, rational, senseless, malicious, careless, and accidental. One only has to have lived around Cape Town for the past 10 days to see what environmental, economic, and social havoc humans playing with fire carelessly or maliciously can cause. I want to look briefly at some biomass comparisons to show how out of balance we are with the other important forms of life on the planet. Our numbers weigh about 300 million tons right now. The animals that serve us with our needs number about 600 million tons, and they include also the animals that are not of productive use, the horses and cows, and the horses and cats and dogs and what have you. And the large wild mammals, that's anything from 50 kgs about there, a springbok and an impala upwards, because it's impossible to count the biomass of rats and mice. The large wild domestic animal mass is only 100 million tons and falling, and that includes 100-ton blue whales and elephants and hippo and bison and elk and moose and caribou and wildebeest and zebra and many, many others. To give you an idea of what's happening, African elephant numbers were 1.5 million in 1978 and are down to 400,000 today. That's how out of balance we are with other forms of life and how quickly we're getting more out of balance with them. And one of those magnificent elephants is killed by a human every 15 minutes. I want to look at two situations briefly, past and present, to just indicate how our mindset has not shifted in 2,500 years. And those are the two situations, and they're situations that are almost identical. The past situation occurred in Greece. The second is occurring in KwaZulu-Natal today, around the presidential residence, for example, and with this Tugela River water that I pointed around. I did forget to mention that when there are heavy rains and floods in the Tugela catchment, this siltation level exceeds 30%. And suddenly the 300 million tons a year of lost topsoil doesn't seem so fanciful. This was at that date. This is ongoing today. This was written up in Critias And this is in various publications, research papers, and reports. That was written by Plato, and it was ignored by Alexander the Great and other Greek leaders. And this has been written up by a whole variety of authors working on the problem, and it certainly is ignored by current leaders. So that's an indication of the behavioral shifts that we're going to have to consider, because they've been more or less frozen like this for 12,000 years. This report in 1998 by the KwaZulu Department of Environmental Affairs was generated over the past 19 years. This department has been underfunded, under-resourced, understaffed, and ignored. We need to have some simple revolutionary goals for an environmental revolution. And we can't make them too long. They can't be pages and pages. They have to be, I think, fairly crisp and clear and short to maintain our focus. We need biodiversity and bioabundance. I say bioabundance because it's not good enough to have a few remnants of a species in zoos and a few nature reserves. They need enough habitat to be bioabundant. They need enough habitat to interact with other forms of life, as well as soil, air, and water, to deliver the ecosystem services that humanity needs into the future. And that biodiversity with bioabundance sustains those ecosystem services, including the resources for mass middle class prosperity, those sorts of things there. So that's a simply stated goal for us to pursue during the next 12,000 years. What will it take? Every second year, the WWF generates a living planet report, and it covers losses in habitat, threatened species, species going extinct, what's going on in our planet. The latest report, released 3 months ago, informs us that wild vertebrates have decreased by more than half over the past 50 years. We look at the African elephant, from 1.5 million to 400,000. It's decreased by more than 60% over the last 50 years. And this is what Marco Lambertini had to say when this report was released. Finding solutions will require the deepest cultural and behavioral shifts ever experienced by any civilization. And you can access that report, if you wish to, at that link there. So, in discussing behavioral shifts, I would like to look at our economy. Wrongly structured, doesn't recognize natural capital, no alternatives to incessant growth, and is generally, in economies all over the world, extractive and exploitative. They do not generally focus on conservation and construction from a biological point of view. I will want to look at a few cultural and social issues. Obviously, there are numerous issues, and they're very wide-ranging. I'm just choosing a few as illustrative examples. And we can look at the spiritual issue, because we know that in the human mind, body, and soul, that right spirit leads to right action, and wrong spirit leads to wrong action. And we've seen that all before, too. So this I want to do in the framework of sustainable human carrying capacity. Now, estimates vary from 2.2 billion to 4.5 billion humans, if you think of that biomass comparison, as a sustainable carrying capacity. And they vary widely. There are so many variables. How many of these people are vegetarians? How many drive motor cars? How many own and fly around in jet planes? That sort of thing. But I'm going to choose a sort of middle-of-the-road figure from a very credible organization and use, for argument's sake, 3 billion people. If we look at, if we were to achieve that, the 3 billion humans would weigh then 40 million tons in that carrying capacity sense, instead of 100 million tons. And if we were to get the same services in proportion from domestic animals, we would have 240 million tons of domestic animals compared to 600 now. And the large wild mammals would grow to a healthy 250 million tons from the miserable and declining 100 million tons of wild mammals that we have now. First, we look at the economy. The current trap is that economies have to grow incessantly. You don't hear anything else from economists and presidents and ministers of finance and what have you. And the population must increase incessantly because you need young people and growing populations to work and consume and build new houses and do all of those things that old people like us don't do much of anymore. And if you can't get it, you need immigration. And if you can't get that, you need incentives if breeding is too slow. So out of touch with reality is the current trap with our current environmental concerns is that in recent years, both Australia and Singapore have offered cash incentives to families to breed, to grow their economies. And that is totally out of touch with the future reality of 9 to 12 billion people struggling for resources of good soil, fresh air, and clean water. So what would we like to have with regard to a change in our economy as a future scenario? Well, we want a contracting or steady state economy. And most people will tell you that's totally unrealistic. And we want 3 billion people. And most people will tell you that's totally out of touch with reality. But do bear in mind, we're not looking at that quick library burning revolution. We're looking at a steady, slow revolution over time. I'm indebted to the next few minutes to this author and his latest book for the information that I'm about to give you. And I look at the Japanese economy as it is today and how it is developing into the future. And I show this slide because Japan is an overcrowded island, but for 300 years it's had an excellent record of sustainable forestry management. So its mountains are not bleeding into the sea like those of Plato's Greece into the Malian Gulf. And that's a fact worth knowing. So what does the Japanese economy look like in 12,017? It has a population of 127 million, but it's declining. It has an aging population. This problem of no economic growth and an aging population, the highest proportion of old people of any country on the planet, the so-called grey flag, as Clem Santa calls it. It has poor to zero economic growth and has had so for more than 20 years. And it has an incredibly high national debt, 260% of GDP versus the basket case of Greece with only 170% high national debt percentage of GDP. There is no immigration to grow the population and economy. It's an isolated culture, and it's a very, very long way to go if you live in Syria or Libya. So it's not going to happen. And it's resource poor. It doesn't have coal or oil or gas or diamonds or platinum or steel or any of those things. So you look at that, you'd show that to an economist, and the economist would say, all bad, bad news, right? Well, maybe it's not such bad news. The predicted population will be only 95 million in 12,050, in just 33 years' time. The per capita slice of the GDP is therefore increasing in a no-growth economy as the population decreases. In fact, even if the economic growth declined to a negative, if it kept in harmony with the declining population, everybody would remain as prosperous in Japan as they do now. The Japanese are unconcerned and adjusting to the fact that they have the largest proportion of old people of any country in the world, and to a no-growth scenario. Less than 5% of their national debt is held by foreign countries versus Greece, more than 95%. How is it possible then for them to survive? Well, the Japanese are great savers. They are largely not infected with affluenza, and if they have money in their hands, the first thing they think is save, and then they think spend. And as a result, they are prepared to lend money to their government at 0% or even a negative interest, a very happy situation when you're very deeply in debt. And they're prepared to do so without burning tyres in the streets in return for their pensions and their other social benefits. So is this so unrealistic? Is it such a pipe dream? It's already happening somewhere in the world. Can we do this? Probably yes. In the words of Clem Sunter, with a flat economy and a declining population, the Japanese will achieve that which is the fervent wish of many countries, rising income per head. Welcome to a new model for economic success. I might add to that also a new model for environmental success, with a declining population, rising natural capital per head, more good fertile soil, more fresh air, and more clean regular water supply per head. In the cities, you will have more space for more and bigger parks, replacing houses with trees instead of the normal situation of replacing trees with houses. We now look at some cultural issues, attitudes to family, the status of farmers and farming, and human burial rights, behavioral. Just a example of some changes that we need to look at. If we look at family, obviously if we're going to move from 7-point-something billion people to 3 billion people, we need to move from something like that to something like that. The kind of role model we need at the top in our own country. So what are the obstacles to getting into the human mind the essential development of reduced family size? Cultural obstacles. Zulu patriarchies requiring many more sons than daughters. Religious. Breed more Catholics, breed more Sunni Muslims, let's outnumber the opposition. Nationalistic and patriotic. Breed another soldier for the Third Reich. In South Africa, have another white baby to celebrate the 5th anniversary of the Republic. Poverty, a very close link there. Educational emphasis, how we educate our children from grade 1 to grade 12 and after that. And the status of women affects the size of families hugely. So what do we do about it? We need an education that has a custodianship of life as a moral imperative with a pro-life curriculum and an emphasis on ecosystem of services provided by life, soil, air, and water, and the way that they're connected. In grade 1, children need to be told that soil forms at a few centimeters per 1,000 years. They might not understand it then, but if they keep getting it by matric, and particularly if they get a few questions about it in matric, they're going to understand it then. Women's rights and education. If you educate women, if you give them equal rights, if you give them good opportunities, they have smaller families. And finally, political leadership. An example from the top, very important. What does society around the world think of this man, a farmer, and what he does, farming? And what does it think of his friends and advisors, a fellow Zulu, an Engelsman, and a Boer? Generally, throughout history, farmers have been held in low esteem. The English word boerish comes from the Lower German, Dutch, Afrikaans, boer, and it means unsophisticated, uncultured, coarse. It's been wired into our attitude to farms and farming for many generations. So it is not a profession. Any damn fool can go farming. That's the general feeling. I've experienced this myself. I'm a veterinarian, and when people sometimes meet Ardington, the veterinarian, without knowing he's a farmer, there's an attitude of recognition that you're a professional person and what have you. Sometimes when they meet Ardington, the farmer, without knowing he's a veterinarian, that's absolutely not the case. And it's quite stark when it happens. So I can feel this personally. I have a friend who is the chaplain of that elite school, St. John's College in Johannesburg, Jacques Pretorius. And he told me of a story in which a young boy came to him in distress because he was being severely ridiculed and verbally abused by the other boys. And one of the things that he brought to Jacques Pretorius was that he was being ridiculed constantly because he had expressed an interest in farming as a career. How sad that these elite urban boys should have that attitude. So, the other problem leading on from this is that poor or no professional education is acceptable, and illegal and immoral practice is acceptable. Whoever heard of a farmer or anybody else being prosecuted, tried, convicted, and sentenced for transgressing our very, very good Soil Conservation Act? It doesn't happen. Over the past 22 years, tens of thousands of hectares of farmland have been handed over to land claimants and to entrepreneurial farmers, black farmers. Well and good. I have no quibble with that. It needs to be done. However, so many of them are put in that position with no proper education, no experience, no good mentoring, and many of these farms have descended into a social and economic, because once the farm doesn't get generate an income, the workers don't get paid, and productive and environmental collapse. So one poses the question, are these people being put on the land to conserve it and prosper from it, or to ruin it? And our attitude to farming in this country and around the world definitely needs to change. And we need leadership and example. This man, General Jan Smuts, is sadly remembered for not quite coming to grips with South Africa's racial politics during his career. But he wasn't only a statesman, he was also a boer, an ecologist, and a botanist. And so enthusiastic was he that he walked thousands and thousands of kilometers in the South African veldt during his lifetime, which he loved dearly. And he never passed up an opportunity to stress the importance, for example, when he was opening an agricultural show, to stress the importance of conserving our veldt, our soil, our natural resources. A very intelligent man, and so keen was he on his amateur hobby of being a botanist that he discovered on his farm a species of grass which was named after him at the time. And once he was asked, how do you, General Smuts, find time to be a part-time botanist? And he said, on the contrary, I'm a part-time general who's a full-time botanist. This is the kind of leadership we need in South Africa, and from yesterday in America, we don't have it. So the future farmer in 12,000 years' time needs to be a respected, well-educated, legally compliant, ethical, environmentally affirming professional who looks after the wildlife on his farm, who conserves riverine vegetation and doesn't plow right up to the riverbank. All of that good professional environmental stuff. And the recognition of a farmer also needs to change, that farmers work in the most important sector of the energy business. They provide sustainable energy for the most awesome form of life on the planet, the human brain. We, I'm saying me, farmers, underpin human civilization. Because if we don't have energy for that brain, then we get into very deep trouble. So burial rights, a culturally and religiously sensitive issue. And perhaps that's why it's a good one to grasp. These burial rites reach their extreme in these enormous tombs into which mummified corpses were put. With the technology that they had available, the Egyptians couldn't afford to do this, paying decent wages. They had to have slave labor to get the job done. So all of this came at an enormous economic, social, and environmental cost. The great irony is that some of the mummies in these tombs, with their promise of eternal life, a few thousand years later, end up in a museum in London or Berlin. So what are the environmental consequences of many of the current burial or cremation rites? They both deny scavengers and plants the nutrients, valuable concentration of nutrients in corpses and carcasses. Cemeteries occupy valuable space that could be put to economic use, social use, or simply left wild, generating ecosystem services. And cultural compliance is carbon and resource consumptive: refrigeration, transport, coffins, tombs, etc. Cremation pollutes the air. Burning a high moisture content corpse takes a lot of fuel, and it pollutes the water because there's a mess to clean up afterwards, and it is likewise carbon and resource consumptive. So what can we do about this? How can we change? How can we shift that behavior over time with a slow, rational, steady revolution? This American naturalist had this to say when he was dying: "If my decomposing carcass helps nourish the roots of a juniper tree or the wings of a vulture, that's enough immortality for me." If you're a South African, you can replace the juniper tree with a marula, like I have, or choose the tree of your choice, or take the tree of your choice. Is there any precedent over the past 12,000 years? Is there any precedent for this kind of thing in human culture and religious rites? Indeed there is, and that is Tibetan Buddhist sky burial, Biaka Tor, which literally means bird scattered. What happens here is that the corpse is taken to a remote, rocky, high mountain top and left there for scavengers and carrion birds. That spreads the nutrients, the concentrated nutrients in the corpse, far and wide, and recycles old life into new, which has been the natural order since life began. And I think we need to get over some behavioral hang-ups about that and start thinking along those lines. Very often things that develop in religion come about as a result of practical problems. And the practical problem is Tibet is that you can't dig a grave very easily. Tibet, it's full of mountains and rocks. And the other practical problem is that there's hardly any timber there, so you can't cremate a body. So not only is this a religious rite, it's a good practical solution, and we need to find good practical solutions for all our other burial rites. Human spirituality. We know so well that when the human spirit's in the right place, it does things right, and sometimes wonderfully right with great creativity. And when it's wrong, it does things wrong, and sometimes dreadfully wrong with great destructiveness. So what goes on in the human spirit is important to any revolution. For most of history, religions have focused on society and human relations, how we relate to each other, love your neighbor as yourself, do unto others. It's focused on economics, how you regard your possessions, your money, your material wealth, how you deploy it, what you do with it, how much goes to your family, how much goes to other resources, and also to godliness, to measure yourself against the standard of a more perfect higher being, represented by a person or God, or indeed in Christianity, a fusion of the two. There's been very little emphasis over the centuries on the environment. Despite the writings of Plato and civilizations coming into being and collapsing for thousands of years around them, the great Middle Eastern religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam have written very little and have very little to say about our custodianship of the natural world. There has often been silence from religious leaders in the face of environmental catastrophe. Blaubokke and quagga going extinct, no sermons in the church about that. British princes exterminating whole herds of game outside Bloemfontein just for fun. Nobody worried about that from a religious point of view. And occasionally, a religion has been an agent of environmental destruction, as in Easter Island and Egypt. So what are we going to do about that? This man, William Wordsworth, loved the natural world, wrote a great deal of poetry about it, and like Smuts, walked for thousands and thousands of kilometers through the countryside of England and Europe. And he believed that our connectedness with nature and our appreciation of that enriched the human spirit. And he believed that in the society that he was living in at the time, a divorce from and a disconnection from the natural world impoverished the human spirit. And he wrote quite a lot of poetry about it and agonized it quite a lot. And I'm going to give you an example of that. The world is too much with us, late and soon. Getting and spending, we lay waste our powers. Little we see in nature that is ours. We have given our hearts away. A sordid boon. The sonnet goes on. The sea that bears her bosom to the moon, the winds that will be howling at all hours. For this, for everything, we are out of tune. It moves us not. Great God, I'd rather be a pagan, suckled in a creed outworn. So might I, standing on this pleasant lea, have glimpses that would make me less forlorn, have sight of Proteus rising from the sea, or hear old Triton blow his wreathed horn. What is happening here, I might say that Wordsworth maintained and kept his Christian faith throughout his long life of 80 years. But what he's saying here is that because he's not hearing anything from the church about connected with this nature, nothing in the prayers or the sermons or the church rituals of his time, he's missing something vitally important to his human spirit and, as he sees it, to other human spirits as well. And so, although in his poem addressing his great God, his Christian God in capital letters, he's temporarily thinking, wow, if I can't change things here, if I can't have this access to my spirituality, I need to look at something else, at these Greek demigods and mythological figures in nature and part of nature. So he says, being in contact with the natural world and around us, it moves it not. Great God, I'd rather be a pagan, suckled in a creed outworn, if this carries on. And I think we need to take notice of this in our spirituality and take deep notice of it. Of course, Wordsworth's spiritual worldview has a precedent. The Australian Aborigines recognized spirit in the landscape and living things. And our own San people regarded the eland as a holy animal in which the spirit of their god existed. Not a bad philosophy as far as looking after life is concerned when you've never been exposed to any other religious influence. So I think that it's time for a new covenance of connected with this life, of sanctity and reverence, time for religion to participate in the environmental revolution. And of course, we desperately need, because there are a lot of them, to have agnostic and atheistic people on our side, and they need to develop a personal philosophy that aids rather than hinders our evolution. To put it briefly, if you cannot find it in yourself to worship Father God, then worship Mother Nature, because that's going to help our evolution. I'm going to look at a few more aspects of hope now that we've dealt with some of those behavioral shifts we need to use. Together with overgrazing, abuse of the plough was a very important agent bearing all that soil to the wind in the formation of the American Dust Bowl. Increasing numbers of farmers have discarded this implement. They don't have one on their farms anymore. They use a sophisticated, modern, technologically advanced seed drill to leave the mulch of the previous crop on the surface, not plough it in, not burn it, open a little line in the mulch and precision plant a seed there, leaving all the mulch in place, conserving the moisture and stopping the soil eroding and blowing and washing away. In Australia, it is now illegal to burn sugarcane before harvesting it. It's normal in South Africa to get rid of that extraneous matter. And they have developed green stick harvesters there that are also high-tech and leave the mulch after the harvest of the sugarcane crop behind and effect moisture and soil conservation and improvement of the soil in that way. And increasing numbers of farmers are having animals, as they used to do, graze their crop residues. Not only do these animals bring biodiversity that is visible in themselves and in the cattle egrets, they also bring and stimulate invisible or less visible biodiversity of benefit to the soil. Dung beetles, earthworms, bacteria, helping this mulch rot quicker and form humus and improve the soil. And other farmers are saying, we shouldn't flog the soil continually with a monoculture crop. It needs periods of rest and fallow occasionally. And they put in crops like this, a mixture of sun hemp and sorghum forage, and also have a grazing component there, bringing the animal factor back to the land like that. Our soils have lived with animals for millions of years. We've only taken the animals away since the tractors came a very short while ago. And there is a symbiosis between soils and animals, as we've seen. This particular farmer here, Andre Lund, took a very good hard look at those historical accounts of grazing animals in the grassland environments of the world, and he took a good, strong look at what happens with that natural cycle on the Serengeti. And he said, there's something here. There's something that has gone on for millions of years here, followed by a long recovery for the period in the veldt, that I need to emulate and have a look at. So he devised a system of crowding his sheep and cows together just like that, just like you never see them when you drive from here to Johannesburg. And what he did, because he's an inventive man, is he invented this apparatus, considering at the base here a solar panel with a timing device, an electric fence energizer, a weight here with a little pulley wheel. Cable goes down there, and that cable is attached to a black insulated hook under these 3 electrified wires which herd the cattle and sheep. And he sets a timing device, and when that timing device goes off, it causes that weight to drop to the ground, and it pulls up the hook, and the 3 wires are yanked up into the air, opening a gate for the animal to walk through. And there you see in the background the next strip that's going to open up in an hour's time for them to go to. And he has somewhere between 8 and 10 strips a day to do this. Notice where the animals just left. Nobody comes back here because there's nothing to eat. They're just waiting for that next gate to open over there. Notice this ground here and compare it to Sir John Fraser's account of the migration through Beaufort West, left looking as if a fire had passed over it. Here is the grass that we saw. You've seen this slide in the Karoo National Park, and I told you that the farm on which Beaufort West was established was originally called Hoevlakte because of so much grass that was visible there. After that, grazing the land and resting and recovering it for a whole year, and in a drought for 2.5 to 3 years, this is what he does. Andre Lund had that to show me, with 20 millimeters less rain than the Karoo National Park in the previous year. Well-protected soil, plenty of ecosystem services, support of all kinds of birds, grassland birds and other life in this situation. So when Andre Lund wakes up in the morning, he asks himself a question. How can I today shift the millions of grass plants under my care to this vigorous, deep-rooted, carbon-trapping, air-freshening and oxygenating, water-cleaning and regulating, soil-conserving and building grass plant here on the right, and away from this weakened, overgrazed, dying grass plant here on the left? Then he has a cup of coffee, walks out onto the farm, and spends the rest of his day, every day, answering that question. That's the kind of future farmer we need. So in these hopeful revolutionary starts, we have a high-tech seed drill doing that, a high-tech sugarcane harvester doing that, fallow and resting soils and adding animals with high-tech portable electric fencing, and the innovative grazing management of Andre Lunt. So in this situation, instead of having technology as a problem, we have technology as an environmental lover, not an environmental rapist. And that forms part of where we need to go with our technology for our revolution. Can I give you some more hope after that depressing first lecture for a slow revolution? Can I give you another example of a highly successful slow revolution? I can, and it concerns democracy, slaves, and women. 2,400 years ago, the Greeks started an experiment with democracy. And it's generally accepted today that democracy is better. A good functioning democracy is better than dictatorship, is better than monarchy, is better than any other form of government if we can make it work reasonably well. So they started this, but it was hugely imperfect because in their society they still had slaves and half of them were women with no vote and didn't have equal rights to men. Nearly 2,200 years later, this famous man gave a very famous speech after the Battle of Gettysburg in America's Civil War. And he had this to say in his speech: all men are created equal. And he also committed himself to democracy by saying, government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. Wise and wonderful words. And yet all of the women in his audience didn't have the vote and didn't have equal rights to those men. And America was still a slave country when he made the speech. To his credit, he emancipated the slaves. But women got the vote and other rights more than 70 years after he died. This slow revolution over 2,000 years continues. I graduated as a veterinarian in 1971. 2 of my class of 46 were women. Today, regularly, this country and America and Britain graduates more than 75% women veterinarians every year. And all of the administrative, leadership, and academic structures of my profession will be totally dominated by women in 20 years' time. So the revolution continues. So to quote another American president, can we effect this slow revolution? Yes, we can. We did it here. I close with the quote, which I'm not going to read, I'll just leave it up there, of a famous South African who wrote this on the first page of his book, Cry the Beloved Country. Thank you.